Now I'll introduce Lisa Kaborycha, who is well known to all of you, a very valuable member of our History of Art faculty, a PhD in Renaissance History of Art from University of California, Berkeley, 13 years, a growing legend in Florence, and a really entertaining speaker. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa now to learn all about Machiavelli's life and thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. As always, it's an honor and a privilege to speak at the British Institute, but especially for me, it's thrilling as an educator to be actually here with human beings in the hall, and of course, with all our virtual human beings online. Somebody said to me the other day when she heard that I was giving this talk, the Epicurean Machiavelli, wow, how great, I'm looking forward to your talk about Machiavellian food. Well, I don't want to disappoint anybody, but I'm really not going to be talking about Machiavellian food very much. A little bit I will. Of course, the way the word Epicurean is used, commonly speaking, we talk about an Epicurean as someone who really loves good food and good wine, the sensual pleasures of life, and that is one of the meanings of Epicurean. But I am going to also be speaking about the Epicurean philosophy, the Hellenistic philosophy that was reintroduced to Florence in the 15th century and how it affected Machiavelli's thinking. So, in terms of Epicureanism, let's say that, you know, the food and drink aspect is sort of the vulgar Epicureanism. So let's start with Machiavelli and vulgar Epicureanism. This is in one of the letters of Machiavelli to his friends. There's a beautiful edition that was edited by Atkinson and Sykes, and this is his translation. We have many, many extant letters between Machiavelli and his friends, and they're very lively, fascinating correspondence. So here he is writing to his friend Francesco Vettori, who is in Rome, and he's describing what he's imagining, the fun that Vettori and his friends are having in Rome together. And Machiavelli writes, "If I knew how to paint, I should capture him on canvas, because some of his typical gestures, some of his sidelong glances, and some of his superior posturing can in no way be rendered in prose." This is their friend Filippo Casavecchia that he's referring to. "I see you all at table, the bread, the glasses, and the table with its trestles brought in, and everyone happy, or rather exuding happiness. Eventually, everybody is drowned in a flood of good cheer. After the eating and drinking takes place, Machiavelli imagines a little hanky-panky going on. And he says, I see Jove before the chariot and chains. I see you inspired by love." And then he indulges in sort of verbal histrionics in talking about these sexual acts that he's going to imagine his friends engaging in. He says, "Now you would like to turn into a swan so you could lay an egg in her lap," talking about the mythology of Leda and the swan. "Now turn into gold so she could carry you in her pocket," referring, of course, to Danae and the shower of gold. And if it sounds like, you know, kind of subtle, you know, Freudian sort of imagery that he's going into here, that's absolutely what Machiavelli is referring to. And the letters are laced with this kind of sexual allusion. In fact, some of it much more explicit than this. Here is a letter that Vettori writes back to Machiavelli in January 1515, and he says, "I know of nothing that gives me more delight to think about and to do than fucking. Every man may philosophize all he wants, but this is the utter truth, which many people understand this way, but few will say." And of course, you know, when we look at these kind of letters, we see this strange, you know, juxtaposition of seriousness and utter, you know, obscenity between Machiavelli and his friends. And Machiavelli comments on it. He writes back to Vettori and he says, "Anyone who might see our letters, honorable compare, and see their variety would be greatly astonished. Because at first it would seem that we were serious men, completely directed towards weighty matters, and that no thought could cascade through our heads that did not have probity and magnitude. But later, upon turning the page, it would seem to the reader that we, still the very same selves, were petty, fickle, lascivious, and were directed towards chimerical matters." which is exactly what we're all thinking, right, when we read these letters. So we see a lot of self-awareness here from Machiavelli. Of course, these two men were very serious men. Vettori was the ambassador to Rome at the time, and Machiavelli, throughout this long period of 1498 to 1512, was working in the second chancery of the Florentine Republic under Soderini, and he was the envoy to such people as the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of France, and famously Cesare Borgia. And this is just one of the letters that I copied from the Archivio di Stato, where you can see Machiavelli's cipher, and it's been deciphered interlinearly in writing back to his bosses at the Palazzo Vecchio. Okay, but of these two men, these very serious men, the one that is famous to us today and most well known in the subject of my talk today is, of course, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli has come down to us in history, not because of those many beautiful witty letters, not because of his brilliant comedy, La Mandragora, the Mandrake, not because of the art of war, his discourses to Tito Livio, but because of this slender little volume, The Prince. And this is why we're here today, and this is why I'm going to be exploring some of the influences and the philosophical impact, especially of the writings of Lucretius on Machiavelli. So here is the title page of The Prince. This is the first edition that was published in Rome in 1533, actually with papal permission initially. It was never published within Machiavelli's lifetime. Machiavelli most probably completed The Prince, at least he was writing it in 1513, but it did not see the light of day until after his death, where it created quite a splash very, very quickly. The word Machiavelli became a common way of referring to a villain. In fact, these various examples of English theater, you can see that the Machiavel was a stock character, kind of the guy who's twisting his mustachios and creating all kinds of havoc and doing evil deeds. In fact, it's also been speculated that the term that we use for the devil in English, Old Nick, derives from Niccolò Machiavelli. This image, by the way, of the Old Nick barley wine, I got from Bill Connell's edition of The Prince. That's one of the books that's out here for you today that we have at the British Institute. So the Machiavel becomes a synonymous figure with an evil, unscrupulous individual who is actually enters onto the stage by the end of the 16th century. And of course, we know that to be Machiavellian, you know, it's never a good thing to have your name turned into an adjective. And of course, to be Machiavellian is used today to refer to anybody who's sort of unscrupulous, anyone who sort of goes by a very easygoing, the end justifies the means way of navigating in life. Many politicians are known as being Machiavellian. For a while, I kept a record of all the various times I saw in the New York Times and elsewhere people referred to as Machiavellian, Kim Jong-un and others. The list goes on, and I just stopped. I stopped keeping that list. But the reason that Machiavelli got this rep is because of his writing style and the content of The Prince, which was so shocking to contemporaries and is still shocking today. He was a very good writer, and his sound bites tend to stick with you. So, for instance, one of the pieces of advice that he gives in this volume is the prince should not deviate from what is good, but know how to do evil when necessary. Also, a great soundbite that everybody remembers when they read The Prince is much better to be feared than to be loved. But the part I think that gets under people's skin the most, and I know for contemporaries that became very disturbing, was when Machiavelli advocates using evil and evil strategies and ways of dealing with problems in the world. And he specifically says that the prince should avoid the bad use of compassion. Who knew there was bad uses for compassion? But this is Machiavelli. And he wrote, the prince should appear to be a man of compassion, faith, humanity, integrity, and religion. And nothing is more necessary than to seem to possess this last quality, that is religion. because men generally judge by their eyes, not their hands. And though all will see you, few will be close enough to experience what you do. So it's important to seem to have all these good virtuous qualities, these compassion and these so-called Christian virtues, but the important thing is to appear that way, but to act in ways that are necessary. And so this is how Machiavelli came to be viewed in such a extremely negative light, especially because of his attitude towards religion and towards Christianity. So, for instance, Cardinal Reginald Pole, only very few years after the book first was published, describes Machiavelli, and he says in his letter to Charles V, he portrays for us such a prince that if Satan were to reign in the flesh and were to have a son to whom he were to bequeath sovereignty after his death, he would give him no other instructions than those found in this book. All right, so, you know, the idea of Machiavelli as Old Nick, as a devil, as somebody who's anti-Christian and a son of Satan is something that sticks to him very, very soon. He's not even cold in his grave before he's being attributed with all these evil qualities. And in fact, to this day, especially the aspect of his religious belief or lack thereof is something that historians and, you know, readers of Machiavelli think about all the time. I remember when I was a graduate student and I was having lunch with my mentor, Jean Brucker, and I wanted to start up a conversation. And I said, if you could go back in a time machine, who would you want to meet in the Renaissance? And without missing a beat, Jean said to me, Machiavelli. I'd really like to know what he was thinking. And I think we all agree with that. So what I'd like to do is discuss and look at this idea of what he was thinking. Now, spoiler alert, I am not going to answer this question for you because much greater minds than mine have wrestled with this idea. But I would like to give you at least some bit of insight that I've gained from looking at his reception of Lucretius, to be able to try to kind of get a little bit into the way that this man was thinking and reasoning. So I'm going to be talking about Epicureanism. And Epicurus, as a Hellenistic philosopher, was not unknown prior to the Renaissance. In fact, Dante, in Inferno 10, puts his friend Guido Cavalcanti's father in this level with the Epicureans. And he specifically condemns the Epicureans because he says Epicurus and his followers said the soul dies with the body. Okay, in this part, the materialistic thinking of Epicurus is exactly what made him be condemned by the Catholic Church, his philosophy. But Dante and his contemporaries did not know much more about Epicurus. The writings of Epicurus, and specifically the reception by the Roman writer Lucretius, was unknown to people in medieval times. So there's very, very little specifics that people had about Epicureanism at this time, specifically about Lucretius. It wasn't until 1417 when Poggio Bracciolini, the Florentine humanist, was digging around in one of these monasteries in Alsace that he found a manuscript copy of De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, written by Lucretius in the 1st century BCE. So Epicurus was the original Greek philosopher, the founder of Epicureanism, worshipped as a kind of god by his followers. And it wasn't until several centuries later that this Latin writer wrote this exquisite poem in Latin explaining and giving in detail the philosophy of Epicurus. So there was an incredible explosion in the 15th century once Lucretius appeared, his writings appeared to Florentines. It was not only barely a century went by, however, that Lucretius was then banned by the Florentine Synod. So you can see here where it says such books as Lucretius's poem, where he defies the mortality of the soul, and it offends every human being, should not be taught in the schools. The idea of reading this author, I should just say for a moment, just summarize very, very briefly the salient points that were disturbing to the authorities of the church here in Florence, that everyone was talking about who was reading Lucretius at the time. First of all, Lucretius embraced atomic theory. The pre-Socratics, Democritus and others had posited that everything was made of atoms. Lucretius, Epicurus went even further, as expressed by Lucretius, in terms of saying that all around us is a void and the rest is atoms. Specifically, however, Lucretius, in expressing this materialistic idea, says that these atoms that are moving about at random, of which we are all composed, are not controlled by any predestination, by any gods. The fact that, that the Epicurean philosophy does not allow for the action of the gods to affect human behavior was very, very important. If you think about the Enlightenment and you think about the idea of a clockmaker god who sort of gets things started and then is a hands off, that's similar to what Epicureanism is going for. So there's an idea that, yes, the gods set everything in motion, but we're all on our own after that. And this is something, obviously, when it's being interpreted and read by Christian readers, becomes problematic, that there is no providence, there is no divine plan that is affecting all of us in our everyday lives. So this was considered very, very dangerous. And it was condemned for that reason and others that I'll be going through as I move along. All right, so what I'm going to be speaking about is this little volume, and it's a very little volume that I encountered in Rome in the Vatican Library about 10 years ago. I was not the first person to find it. I'm all going to make a claim to that. But my study as a doctoral student was looking at commonplace books copied by Florentines in the 15th century. And when I found out that there was such a book copied by no other than Niccolo Machiavelli, I thought, this is my chance that I can actually see what this man was thinking about. So I went to the Vatican and I was told to dress very carefully and to prepare my answers because I was going to be interviewed. There was going to be a kind of mini inquisition before I was allowed to look. And I thought, oh no, I'm going to look at a work of Machiavelli's who was, on the papal index. And oh my gosh, it's going to be, Lucretius, who I knew was banned by the Florentine Synod. I was so nervous, but no problem. In fact, now I've found that if you go on the Vatican website, this entire book has been scanned digitally and anybody can look at it. So no biggie anymore. In any case, it's a sedicesimo, so it's about this big. It's a small book, and the manuscript contains two works in Latin, Lucretius's On the Nature of Things and Terence's The Eunuch, all copied in Machiavelli's hand. He copied it himself, and I think it's very interesting that it's a little book in this format, sort of like a, like a pocket book that you can just stick in your bag and just go. And I can imagine him galloping on to his embassies to various, dignitaries and throwing this in his saddlebags. And so this is the volume Rosciano 884 that Machiavelli copied Lucretius in. And by the way, you can see up here his writing, which has been crossed out, interestingly, by somebody, we don't know whom, but it says Nicolaus Machiavellus scripsit feliciter, and it's the inscription on the inside of the cover of the book. And I thought it would be very interesting to look at this through the perspective of these Zibaldoni manuscripts that I studied in the Biblioteca Nazionale. So I looked at volumes like these. For instance, over here, we've got a copy of the Ars Amatoria of Ovid's, but copied in Vulgare. And here down at the bottom, when this copyist is talking about how to pleasure women, you've got this manicule or finger, not just pointing at the text, but pointing through what looks quite like female genitalia. And I thought, Well, that's kind of an interesting type of marginalia to be looking at. Or this story of St. John the Baptist. And here we've got this woman here, and it says, quella mala fanciulla che ballava così bene. That bad girl who danced so well, which is Salome, right? So I thought, why not see if Machiavelli, when he copied this, did similar things in his text? Well, another spoiler alert, there's not going to be any obscene drawings in the margins. So I'll tell you that right off the bat. Before I get showing you those images, though, I just want to point out that the 2010s were really a great year of harvest for Lucretius and the Renaissance. These three books I recommend very highly if you want more background than I can give you as, you know, a humble scholar of the Renaissance. These are fine historians and philosophers, especially, who have written these books. Alison Brown's Return of Lucretius to Renaissance Florence, where she talks about not just Machiavelli, but Bartolomeo Scala and other humanists in Florence and how they read read Lucretius. Ada Palmer's Reading Lucretius in the Renaissance is fantastic. She looked at over 50 volumes of manuscripts that contained Renaissance people's copies of Lucretius. And she did precisely what I'm looking at doing, you know, trying to figure out what their take was on Lucretius's writings. And Machiavelli wasn't the only one, obviously. Gassendi read Lucretius, also Montaigne and others, and they have their copies. And finally, Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve, where he talks about Lucretius's, or the famous clinamen or swerve, where the atoms swerve at random, and I'll be talking about that in a moment, which is a very, very well-written book and very easily, very accessible to read. So these three writers really have done a fine job in synthesizing much of this material. I want to say that one of the things that Ada Palmer pointed out when she looked at the way Machiavelli read Lucretius, she said, unlike almost any other Renaissance reader of Lucretius, what Machiavelli comments on in the book is not what you would expect. Like, we know from Machiavelli's correspondence with his friends that he loved raunchy, risque stuff. He did not make any comment on any of the passages that have to do with Venus and sexuality. No comments on that. He didn't make any comments on anything that Lucretius had to say about civil society, about politics, which seems strange for Machiavelli. None of the comments on morality, which also seems odd. You'd expect Machiavelli to be commenting on. What Machiavelli seemed most interested in reading Lucretius was first and foremost the atomic theory, and I'll be going into that in a moment. So here we are opening up the volume. This is the folio 1 verso and 2 recto. So just as you open up this slender volume, it's about, I can't remember now, to me it seemed like it was around 150 folios. So it's about 300 pages in this little book. All copied very neatly in Machiavelli's hand. And you can see here, there's no marginalia, right? So here's the text in the middle on folio 1 verso, and you can see there's nothing here on the side. There's just the stamp of the Vatican because it's their volume. And on 2 recto as well, no comments on that side. However, I'm going to just point at a few of the comments, not all of them, because that would take way too long, and you know, I can't go into that depth here. But here we have Machiavelli commenting on Lucretius's atomic swerve. Here is the text in Latin in the center. And on the right, which I've put in a red box, is Machiavelli's marginal comment. So he comments, from motion there is variety, and from it we have a free mind. So when Epicurus had speculated that atoms don't always behave invariably in the same manner, that atoms sometimes can spring off in a direction that you don't expect, what he was theorizing is that is a proof that human beings, being part of this material world and being composed of atoms, can also of our own volition make choices and do things that are not foreordained. And Machiavelli is picking up on this right away here in the text. And he's commenting, that this clinamen, that this swerve is an important, crucial aspect. I think sometimes too, Machiavelli is putting comments in the margins for things not just, oh, isn't this cool? Like most readers would say, oh, this is interesting, or put a question mark. I think he's really trying to get his head around some of these concepts because they're quite complex and not easy. Because we know Machiavelli was fascinated with the issue of free will, right? When you go to the Prince, chapter 25, he discusses how much does fortune affect our lives? How much is chance involved in the deeds of human beings? There's that famous dichotomy that Machiavelli, expresses between fortuna and virtu, right? So there are things that happen in this world that we can't control. Fortune spins her wheel, and you can see her in this image. She's blindfolded and she's spinning the wheel. At the top, we've got a prince, and you fall to the bottom, you become a pauper. And this wheel spins around. And Machiavelli wanted to say, yes, it's true. Bad things happen, good things happen. There are things we can't control. And yet, there are things that we can control. That's where Machiavelli posits this idea of virtu, this innate ability that people have and can develop in order to affect things in the world and to become powerful rulers, especially in terms of becoming a prince. And surprisingly, for the Renaissance, I think, he says it's about 50-50. About half of the things that happen to us are out of our control, but yet the other half we can do something about. Now, that may not seem like a lot to you when I'm teaching my undergraduates, and I'll say to them, well, what do you think? How much is fortuna and how much is virtu in your lives? They usually say, I think it's about 95% under my control, maybe 5%. I can't. Maybe they would say something different nowadays. It seems like fortuna is way out of control for all of us in 2020. But I think it's interesting that this is a Renaissance trend that we're seeing expressed by Machiavelli very early in the 16th century. Oops. Okay. For instance, here's another writer from the late 16th century, an English writer that you may be familiar with. And in the play Julius Caesar, he writes, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves if we are underlings," right? The idea that things are not predestined by astrology. Of course, astrology was a very important influence during the Renaissance. It's not determined by any type of foreordained divine force, not the gods nor God in a Christian sense. So here we've got the Greek gods, and here's an important phrase of Lucretius's that Machiavelli comments on. Lucretius writes, "The gods enjoy immortal life in deepest peace." This is the phrase here that he's written that. "Far removed and separated from our affairs." Machiavelli's comment in the margin is, "Deus non curare mortalia." The gods don't care about the affairs of mortals. Now, this is quite important because Machiavelli is signaling, at least to himself, we believe this was copied around 1497, quite early in Machiavelli's life, just before he became very, very busy with his diplomatic duties. And he's commenting on this fact that, okay, God or gods might exist in this world, and they, perhaps God in a Christian sense has a type of, power of creation of the universe, but all of us are on our own, and there is no intervention, and don't look for help for God. That's up to you to use your own abilities. And he's responding to this Epicurean idea very, very clearly in his text. Another idea that Lucretius expresses, an Epicurean idea, is the idea of constant change, that the world is always in flux. And he writes, time changes the nature of the whole world, and one state of things must pass into another, and nothing remains as it was. All things move, all are changed by nature and compelled to alter. This constant movement and change in the world. And Machiavelli, in his Discourses on Livy, writes, all human affairs are in flux and cannot remain stable. This is an idea that's also echoed in The Prince, where Machiavelli compares fortune to a river. A wild river can sweep things away and change your fortunes in an instant. And a person, to be successful, has to be flexible, cannot be rigid, but must be able to bend with the course of events as they change. So this is something as well that Machiavelli, I believe, has absorbed from Lucretius. Now, going back to that letter, I'm going to get back to the vulgar Epicureanism because it's always a crowd pleaser. This is that letter that I read you before, where Machiavelli says, you know, if anybody read this letter of ours, they would think that we were fickle, lascivious, and just silly people. But he goes on to justify their so-called lascivious and chimerical nature in the following terms. In the same letter, he says, if to some this behavior seems contemptible, to me it seems laudable, because we are imitating nature, which is changeable. Whoever imitates nature cannot be censured. So even in his personal letters to his friends, we see a kind of influence of this Epicurean idea that we don't have to be the same person every single moment of every day. We're changeable throughout our lifetimes. We change. We're in a current, in flux, like the rest of nature. And it's a good thing to be like that. And it's a good thing, and it's an honest thing to recognize this in oneself. And he's saying this is not to be criticized, but to be praised. Now, finally, Lucretius dedicates almost the entirety of Book 3 of On the Nature of Things to arguments persuading people not to be afraid of death. And this is a very, very important aspect of Epicurean philosophy. The idea that, yes, you want to seek pleasure in life. That's where we get the idea of that so-called vulgar Epicureanism, right? The idea is to avoid pain and to seek pleasure, not in, boozing it up and whining and dining, but in terms of spending time with friends, in terms of enjoying the things of nature. And specifically, according to Epicurus, the greatest pleasure is not being in pain, which I think a lot of us can sympathize with these days as well. In any case, here is just one of many of the arguments that Lucretius uses in Book 3. He says, why do you groan aloud and weep at death? For if your former life now past has been to your liking, why not, like a banqueter, fed full of life, withdraw with contentment and rest in peace, you fool? Right? He's saying, don't be an idiot. If you've enjoyed your life, you've had enough. Move away from the table. You've had it. Go home, be happy. And he's saying you should accept death because it's the end of suffering and it's the end of pain. And if you've had a good life, that should suffice. Now I'm going to go to, in finishing up, with one, probably the single most well-known of Machiavelli's personal letters. This is the one he wrote to his same friend, Francesco Vettori, who was in Rome as an ambassador in 1513. This is the letter in which Machiavelli celebrates the fact that, he has survived being tortured in terms of, after he was arrested at the fall of the Republic. He's gone to live at the family home in Sant'Andrea in Percussina. He was not exiled there. He was released from prison, but he lived out the rest of his life in this country home with his family. And he describes writing a little work called De Principatibus, on principalities. And he's really excited for Vettori to read it because he says, I think it's going to be a hit. Little did he know. But he talks about his life in Sant'Andrea in Percussina. And on this side, I've just included an image from Machiavelli's villa in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, where you can see the desk and the study where he did his writing at. He describes his typical day to his friend. And he says, when evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my workday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and put on the garments of court and palace. So he takes off his muddy clothes from that he's wearing all day in the garden, and he puts on his elegant courtly robes. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine and for which I was born. So he sits down and he goes to study the ancient philosophers. And for hours at a time, I feel no boredom. I forget all my troubles. I do not dread poverty, and I am not terrified by death. I think we can all agree here that the philosopher that is the most persuasive and the most powerful in terms of, consoling human beings about the advent of their death is Epicurus, here as expressed by Lucretius. And I think there's no doubt in my mind that that little volume that we were looking at a few moments ago was something that Machiavelli always had at hand and always enjoyed reading. And especially in these very trying last years of his life, he found a lot of consolation in. I'm not trying to persuade you that every single idea expressed in Lucretius's On the Nature of Things were things that were accepted by Machiavelli. For instance, Epicurus had said, don't be involved in politics. All that striving and fighting and, dog eat dog world, that's not the way to live. Forget about politics. Well, we know Machiavelli was a very political animal, and that was advice that he clearly didn't accept. There was a lot in there that I'm sure he didn't find that useful and that he didn't absorb. He was such an original thinker and so sui generis that I think that he wouldn't have accepted any philosopher's thinking whole cloth. Right? He would have been like, Groucho Marx, who said, I would never join any club that would accept me. I think that Machiavelli was that type of thinker, that unusual. But I think we can all agree that, these lines of Lucretius's, if your former life now past has been to your liking, why not like a banqueter fed full of life, withdraw with contentment and rest in peace, you fool. Machiavelli was a lot of things, but he was no fool. And I think he really took these words to heart. Okay, thank you very much for this evening.
Thank you very much, Lisa. If you want to now unshare the screens, the people in the Zoom can come into the room.
The Zoom in, yes.
There we go. I'll just take the position so I can just
yes.
share the camera. So thank you very much, Lisa. And now we can do questions. And as we now have learned how to do, we'll alternate between questions in the room and questions on the Zoom. So we'll start with the room. Michael wants to say something. Michael, would you put your mask up and come and share this microphone?
Do I need a mask?
Probably now, because ideally, Michael, you'll come here because then you'll be on the camera, you see, and then the people on the Zoom can see who's talking. So stand right in front of the lectern.
All right.
There you go.
First of all, congratulations. That was an absolutely marvelous talk.
Thank you.
And in some ways, I'm a bit of a Machiavellian scholar, but not to your level, I can tell you that. It started when I was 16 years old, when I read book 5 of Lucretius's poem. I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten what that talks about in terms of philosophy of contentment in life. Marvelous book. And what you said about the link between Lucretius and Machiavelli, I found absolutely stimulating and right in lines with what I feel about him. I don't want to start on talking about Machiavelli only in 2 ways. Do you by any chance have that wonderful poem of his when he talks, I smile, but the smile does not enter in? And you, well,
no, that sounds lovely.
Well, it's absolutely marvelous. If you want to understand Machiavelli, read that poem, because it's sad, happy, content, and marvelous. Well, if you haven't got it, I will
Definitely share it with me.
I will absolutely share it with you. And in terms of understanding Machiavelli, I don't know how many books I've read about him all over the years, but the one book that helped me to really understand him is a book, the biography by Roberto Ridolfi,
yes, yeah.
Machiavelli, which finishes with a marvelous chapter where he talks, which is entitled The Disarmed Prophet. Here was a man who did not achieve in his life what he wanted to achieve as a patriot of Florence. A magnificent introduction to you really want to understand him. And then the other thing, I think the discourses are so important, because in the discourses he says the best form of government is a republican form of government elected by the people. That's why he admired Rome so much. And in that sense, the need for the prince only came if a republic was not possible for some reason or another. So his first love, in fact, was for the Roman state, the Roman Republic. And he wasn't a tyrannical, he wasn't a man princey, I think, for...
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree.
And a magnificent mind. And yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I will send you that poem. If you don't know it, I'm glad to make a small
Yes, I would love to
contribution.
see the poem. I know the discourses very well, but the poem I'm not familiar with.
Well, thank you so much. I thought it was magnificent, and we ought to have it printed, I think, in some way or another.
Very good. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, I never teach my undergraduates the Prince without teaching the discourses simultaneously. I think if you read the Prince in isolation, you're just getting a skewed vision of Machiavelli. And in the discourses, he's also very, very clear in condemning what he views as a very negative attitude towards Christianity. I mean, he definitely says that Christianity has weakened the spirit of modern nations. And he's very, very harsh, not just against Savonarola in terms of being, an unarmed prophet, but also in terms of, general.
Doesn't he say somewhere that Christianity has perverted true religion?
Yes,
perverted true religion.
Yes.
That's why they hate it.
True.
Very good. I think we'll take one from the Zoom. So if there's anyone in the Zoom who would like to ask questions, Graham has got his hand up. So Graham, will you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, thanks for a fascinating talk. I suppose I would characterize myself as a Machiavellian. I worked in public service as an advisor to politicians. And anyway, my question is this. You mentioned, you showed us the copy that Machiavelli made of De Rerum Natura. I think you said it's now in the Vatican. Could you say a bit about where that manuscript of Machiavelli came from? Do we know what version Machiavelli copied? Could you say a bit about the transmission? Was it published in Florence? Did it circulate in Florence? Thank you.
Excuse me, you mean De Rerum Natura, was it published and circulated in Florence?
Yeah.
Yes, there were a number of editions. There's been speculation about which edition Machiavelli copied from. I can't remember at this moment which one it was. It was one of the incunabula, obviously. How it got to the Vatican, I do not know. That's one of the hardest things in manuscript studies to do, is to trace the provenance of manuscripts. It could be that it got there through one of his friends. We know he was corresponding to Vittoria a lot, but that's just speculation on my part. And I have not found that out. If someone knows that and has access to that information, I would be very happy to hear it.
Thank you. We've got another one in the room. Is there another one in the room? Yes. Do you want to come up to where the microphone is? You can actually use the same microphone as Lisa. Yes. That is hard. Stand there and look into the camera and speak into the microphone. You're in business.
That's right.
You are.
Well, Lisa, that was a wonderful talk and so exciting. I have no questions or comments. One, we heard that Lucretius certainly published several times in Florence. Was this intense private enthusiasm Machiavelli? Were there any other his circle, people he met, or people around in Florence who he could have shared these ideas? I'm thinking particularly about the less well known in a way. I mean, the atomic theory of Lucretius in particular.
Yes, I think that this was, that's an excellent question. And Alison Brown really discusses that in her Return of Lucretius to Florence in the Renaissance, that it was, Lucretius was on everybody's lips. Everybody knew that it was dangerous and it was risky, but she interestingly comments on the fact that, the others who read it, people like Valla, people like Alberti, people who were involved, had benefices from the church, had to be a little bit more careful. But among the circle of the chancellery group, these sort of, secretaries and official, bureaucrats that Machiavelli was part of, absolutely, the gloves were off and they talked about this stuff a lot. And I can imagine, like in the Rucellai Gardens, when he was there, having those discussions that led to the writing of the Discourses on Livy, that, those intellectuals would have been talking about this stuff because it was just so fascinating. I mean, the idea that you could be unlinked from fear of divine retribution, which is something I didn't talk about in the talk so much, because one of the things about being afraid of death was, of course, being afraid of going to hell. In the time of, Epicurus and Lucretius, they were afraid of, gods, striking you down. You had too much hubris, like Niobe or, Arachne or something. You would be struck down by these sort of irrational, violent gods. But, let's face it, the guy who, struck down Job wasn't much kinder. And certainly the Inferno of Dante is a pretty odious place to end up in. So the idea that, God just set all this in motion, but you don't have to worry about what happens after death, because that born from whose no traveler returns, it's not a problem.
Okay, time to turn to the Zoomers. Anyone from the Zoom, put your hand up. Anyone want to ask a question? Or if you haven't got the image, just unmute yourself and say something. No? Nothing from the Zoom. Anyone in the room? We've got the one in the back. Sarah, come up to the microphone, please.
I'm sorry I was late, but I'll watch it rewatch it. So I just wanted to say how interesting it is, this question of free will. At least 10 years ago, maybe longer, the New York Public Library had a series of conversations with the physicist Brian Greene, who is extremely popular in the United States as a physicist, sort of popularizing particularly quantum mechanics. So he was asked at the end of this series of lectures, do you believe in free will? And he said, you'd have to be an idiot to believe in free will. And I thought that was so interesting, and people were just kind of like, really? So the question of free will and physics and atomic matter has gone on as long as we've had it written. I think it's so interesting that physicists are still thinking about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, that's not really a question.
That's such an interesting comment, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, very interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily automatically think atomic theory and human free will. But, in this ancient philosophy, it was linked. Definitely. It's so interesting to hear that modern physicists are still seeing a, connection between the two.
Anyone on Zoom for a question? Don't be bashful. Or comment? No?
No.
More in the room? No? Okay, I think we've probably reached our natural conclusion.
Wonderful.
So I'd just like to thank, on behalf of everyone, Lisa, for a truly fabulous lecture, very interesting insight to Machiavelli, which is I certainly didn't know before. And thank you, and we'll have you back for another one sometime in the new year.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you all for being here tonight and on the screen. Thank you.
And I must end with my traditional plea for your generosity and your pockets. The Institute is going through the beginnings of what's going to be a difficult winter. And to keep going, we really do need to have some income, and we have no public funding. So if you're here and just drop a note in the basket, and if you're online on the Zoom, please go to Just Giving. Anything you feel that you would like to donate is extremely welcome. Thank you very much. And we'll see you all next week. Bye.